my panel people? I know, but I need to make sure my people are comfortable. Wow, the light.
They're all yours, Julie.
Are they?
They're all yours.
Fantastic, fantastic. A very good evening to all of you. Good evening. Wow. This room looks like somebody's having a wedding. It's beautiful, really, really stunning. But it's really great to see all of you back in this room after an amazing opening this morning and a series of really, really impactful and insightful discussions. But I think what we're about to have now crowns it all. The powerful panel that we have this evening is really a powerful way to end the wonderful day and the really exciting day that we have had. So, ladies and gentlemen, this evening, it's about seizing the moment. Seizing the moment to dialogue with our panel and share some introspection on the changing face of leadership in Africa. The current emerging trend of political transparency, ladies and gentlemen, with free and fair elections on our continent is super encouraging. I am excited about it. We've seen the trend this year. You'll agree with me that most of the political transitions we have seen in the last year have, in fact, renewed hope in all of us and have signaled to the rest of the world that Africa can also do it. With our panelists this evening, we will discuss critical key actions that we can all employ to sustain the current political trend that we're all witnessing, and to leverage this momentum for economic development as well on our continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the group of panelists do not need any introductions. We hear of them every day. We see their work. We know them so well. But please, join me to welcome my panelists. I'll just mention their names, but we know them. By starting with Mrs. Gracia Machel, an Africa stateswoman. I know. You love me. I think you're here. Yes, ma'am. We also have Your Excellency Amina Gurib Fakim, most recently the President of Mauritius, a female president. Then we have a glass ceiling. Dr. Herbert Wigwe, our gentleman on the panel, a philanthropist and a CEO extraordinaire of one of the largest banking networks in Africa, Access Bank. Then we have Dr. Obi Ezekwesili, an advocate. Ezekwesili. A powerful advocate all around, a phenomenal woman who has been driving change on the continent. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We're very, very grateful. So, the conversation is going to start, what I see as a really powerful conversation. So let me start with you, Your Excellency, Amina. You have had a remarkable career. Politics at the highest level of a president of Mauritius. and you've been in the academia and social transformation. From your experience, what lessons can we all draw from the emerging nature of political trend that we're all witnessing today?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having this conversation. You're starting with me and you're asking me a very leading question. I think, again, I'll come back to my narrative this morning when I said, let's look to Africa 50 years ago, when it was coming out of, of the colonial presence. And if you look at the quality of the leaders we had then, we had, of course, major freedom fighters who were there, and we're just talking with Madame just now. In terms of the context, we had people who had a will to do something, to free the country, to make things happen on the continent. Of course, we had a living legend who just left us 5 years ago. He was there for a cause. And we have seen the continent being convulsed quite a bit after this. And what we have seen recently has been an emergence of new leaders. New leaders who are now moving away from the army space. We are seeing new leaders who are now professionals, all sorts, a mix of people. And I think this new leadership of the new trained leaders that we have, these are the people who we can count on to change the narrative on the continent. And we are witnessing this, and we've had a long day today discussing all this, and I think this is what is resonating across, is that we need that kind of enlightened leadership to do things differently. And I was saying, I was speaking to Madame Michelle just now, is that there is still space on this continent to transform, to have transformative leadership, exactly as we had 50 years ago, because there's still plenty of space in which we can still make a difference. And I think some of the leaders are gearing up to this. And here, if I may cite a few names, I look at a country, I'll just be very, very honest about it. If you look at what Rwanda had been through, and if you look at what Rwanda is now, I mean, people can say many things, but I think I admire the leadership that President Kagame has brought to his country for now. So, and I'm sure there'll be many more coming through who will actually bring the change that we need and that we actually desire. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Herbert, your banking platform is across many African countries, so you've seen, I know you're in the private sector, but you've seen some of the transformations that we're seeing now. What is your take on it from where you sit as a private sector leader?
No, I think it's important that people understand that the only way the private sector can thrive is when there's good leadership, again, in the public sector.
I agree with you.
They must work hand in hand.
I agree with you.
Now, we're seeing all of those transitions happening in most of the countries that we have been present in, whether it is Rwanda, just as Her Excellency mentioned, or it is places like Sierra Leone, several post-conflict regions, but they're going through much more interesting transformations 10 years after.
Absolutely.
Okay? Now, so we're also beginning to see it in the businesses. So the businesses are picking up and all of that. It is important, all right, that people understand that the only way the private sector can exist, all right, is having a strong public sector presence. And that strong public sector presence only comes from a strong democratic foundation. And that's extremely important.
Amazing.
Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Mrs. Michelle, a real force to be reckoned with. That's how I see you. Listening to Herbert speak, we can clearly see how strengthening health system goes beyond the public sector and how the private sector also gets involved. You have done outstanding work as a philanthropist and have had several accolades in transformation work as well. So as a philanthropist, how do you think non-elected leaders, such as yourselves on this panel, the philanthropists around the room, can positively influence political systems in Africa?
Let me begin by suggesting that any nation should, in my view, have something like a national compact. Clarity on, as a nation, what are the targets and goals we have to achieve together in a certain period of time. And political leadership, business leadership, academic leadership, social organizations of different kinds, including philanthropists, to be clear that we are all part of a nation and we have a national agreement on where we have to go and how to reach certain goals. And that space, we agree, but we take responsibility according to the sector in which we operate, and also we account. So many times we expect us to make governments accountable, but shouldn't we also be accountable in the same space? I mean, business should account to that space. Philanthropists should also account to that space. Academics, to see that we are all working together for a common goal. But your question is, how do you keep government accountable? I think one is, if the goals are clear, then you engage in an exercise of give and take. Because if we go only to ask them, and why you are not doing this and that, the relationship can be very tense.
Yeah.
You say, we as a philanthropist, we offer this. This is what we have been doing, whether it's in health, in education, in different kind of things we are doing. We offer this, but we see the government, for instance, lacking, whether it's legislation, whether it's regulations, what many times is called the environment, the conducive environment. So you indicate where the government has to perfection its responsibilities. In a way, you say also, I recognize I have responsibilities, and this is how I'm performing. So you create a relationship of give and take. That's what I would think it's the healthy way of accountability. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Very well said. And I'm just wondering, Herbert, I'm coming back to you again.
Yes.
Because in all of this, we believe that the private sector has a role. But most of the time, we sit back quite a bit. So coming back to you, because you also have the platform, you're in so many different countries, so you see a lot.
Yeah.
What is your take on that? How do we create this balance, building on what Mrs. Michelle has just shared with us?
We're all jointly responsible for the development of the societies in which we exist. And until we all appreciate that, we cannot hold just the public sector responsible, and we will not make progress. That's the first step.
Yes.
Secondly, we must also realize that the era of just waiting for foreign donors to come in to support the continent is long gone.
Can we give a round of applause?
We have to do it ourselves. If they come, fine. Otherwise, nobody owes the continent anything but ourselves.
Exactly.
Okay? Now, several years ago, my former chairman is seated here, we started a big crusade, for instance, at the time when we're having donor fatigue with respect to AIDS. And we carried that flag and we said we wanted to go across the continent, getting the private sector to support this whole fight against HIV/AIDS. Now, the foreign donors came later, but that was fine. As far as we're concerned, let us come together and work. So it's all about working together. Now, several things need to be done, and I'll bring it down to my own sector. One of the things we found out is that international institutions are technically disintermediating Africa. Understandably so. I mean, they'll tell you about the growing cost of compliance and all sorts of things, across the world. Now, what that does is that if we don't stand up to solve our problems, and I'm talking of both private and public sector, all right, you get into that vicious cycle of poverty. You never get better. And then they keep seeing Africa with all the narratives, despotism, hunger, disease, etc., etc., etc. So the private sector has to stand up. So if you have banks or you're in the financial services sector, you have to rise up to become a global enterprise, all right, to support the continent to grow. So that is what is critical. We all have a role to play, whether it's in the philanthropic space, it's in the medical space, you're in financial services, you are in government, etc. We cannot pass the blame and say, no, it's public sector, they're not doing well. We cannot blame the democratic institutions. After all, we are all a part and parcel of that whole thing. So that is what is important.
Absolutely. Yes. I couldn't have agreed with you more. Fantastic. So I wish we had a room full of CEOs here to hear this in new ways. So Obi, you have also had a very remarkable career and a strong advocate for transparency, accountability, a lot of the policy work that you've done and reforms in Africa. So from your previous roles that you've had, World Bank, and also private sector, philanthropists, governments. You played a facilitation role, I'm sure, with all these various sectors or stakeholders. How do you think philanthropists should hold governments accountable for serving in the best interest of their citizens, doing what is best for their citizens first, putting their citizens first before themselves?
I think that the first thing is to assert that the leitmotif, as you would say, the raison d'etre, the reason that government exists, is that it should be the coordinating mechanism for the rest of society. Somebody's got to lead that
I
process.
like that.
So you've got public sector, private sector, and you've got the citizen sector. But the government, at the end of the day, is the sovereign entity. The nation state has the capacity to be able to set the foundation on the basis of which the rest of society gets signals as to what to do. And that being the case, it means that the superordinate responsibility of government must be established. Every other sector trying to do anything resembling the basic role of government in providing the ambience on the basis of which society functions is simply complementary. So we must not substitute government with private sector or substitute government with the philanthropy sector. That's one. Number two is that for us to be able to clearly understand which sector works better and for what, we need to understand that over time it's been proven that every time government tries to behave like business, it puts the people in trouble. So we don't want governments, straying off into business activities. I recently caused an uproar in my country by saying, hey, stop the idea of trying to do a national airline. We know that the record globally is terrible. The record in my country is worse. And so if it's already broken and you know that you couldn't fix it, find something better to do with your time as government. And then for the philanthropy organizations and the sector, the role that they particularly have is that there are gaps. There are certain gaps in society where government may not be able to reach to. There are things that government may not be able to do as well as that communal spirit, that spirit of buying your social license by participating in the process of helping people within the community. When civil society or philanthropies do this, they do it as a matter of ensuring that they are participants in the process of solving some of the problems of society. Now, if all of this is clearly understood, these role definitions are understood, then what would happen is that for the accountability issue, the public sector, the private sector, as well as the civil society sector, including the philanthropy organizations, would understand that there are certain gaps. For example, there are things that you do well, which when government tries to do it, for example, providing education, some of the non-government actors have learnt some things better than the public school system. How do you bring an intersection of that knowledge with the way that the public sector currently functions? So knowledge sharing. You could also look at issues of gaps in evidence-based policy. Private sector does not just go widely into things. But governments without any strong civil society looking over them can just wake up one morning and decide on a grand project without caring. Without caring that it is a huge opportunity cost for the poor. So evidence-based research, I loved that panel that discussed research earlier today. It was the most fantastic panel here today. And, evidence-based policy orientation. You can force the government into a vortex where it normally would not like to get into, by showing without even, saying a word. You do some research, pay for some research, and you put it out there. And the minister looks at it and bows the head, because it is basically indicting some of the kinds of policy choices that they are making. So investment in a lot of research by your segment of society would help. Number 3 is that you can actually show that principle of accountability. There is a way that private sector pretends to be more accountable, and it's a lie. It's a pretense. I am one of the co-founders of Transparency International. And in our work, we found that the private sector is as rotten. Okay, you got me here. You're going to be candid talk, right?
It's fine.
Yes, we found a level of rottenness within private sector. Private sector never wanted to raise the word corruption at dinner tables. It was considered offensive. But we knew that corruption was completely distorting incentives in development. Now, by private sector putting itself out there and saying, we actually care for transparency, we care for accountability, we don't want to do business in a monkey kind of way, it raises the standard and the quality of conversation around the issues of accountability. I shall shut up now.
No, I'm enjoying the conversation. No, I think very, very, very interesting sort of opinions, viewpoints. They're very, very interesting. Putting the private sector on the spot. I'll come back to you to answer
We'll
that.
talk about
So just prepare. Let me go to Mrs. Michelle. What is your take on this?
Obi is absolutely right that you need to have these big frameworks which we establish the responsibility of each one of us. But in the implementation process, there are those like government will have kind of a top-down approach.
Right.
And business has the ability of fine-tuning, for instance, management things, which many times government can have a policy, but in management is lacking. And business can bring a contribution on how you transform policy into manageable practices which deliver the results which are required for citizens. Philanthropists, for instance, Obi touched the issue of learning. When you have someone who is working on education, you learn the lessons, you go into detail of what is it which produce not only numbers, but produce quality. And in that sense, you bring it to the government to learn, but also you connect with other civil society organizations, then you amplify the lessons in terms of improving the systems. So I think that's why I started my view in terms of a national kind of space in which we agree. So you bring different strengths. Philanthropists, for instance, they have the time. They are not rushing like governments. Government have a 5 years plan, and they have to produce numbers, and so numbers count. But an organization which really invests in education, in health, will take the time which is required. Again, researching, implementing, seeing what works, what is not working. You can take 5 years, you can take 10 years working on the same field.
Yeah.
Government will change in 5 years. Somebody will come anew and have different ideas and change policy, etc. Civil society organizations can give not only stability to how to implement things, but also these lessons can filter even into improving policy when government wants to listen. And I think one of the problems we are facing on the continent is that there's not enough trust amongst I mean, these different sectors.
Yeah.
You know, government sometimes is suspicious that these business people, et cetera, and they go to business because they can provide jobs. And so business is to provide jobs, not to explore other capacities which business can bring
That
to
is
improve,
very, very
I mean, the
true.
management of the country. Civil society organizations, many times they are able to say, oh, you know, this civil society organization, they have an agenda. They have an agenda. Well, yes, because they have chosen one sector in which they want to focus on and to produce results. But if we trust one another, then you can identify the strengths and the ability to produce better results, which again comes back to national policy, and they help them to improve how we move together. So I would insist that we need to find ways of building this trust. Let me give an example of a country where I think they seem to be doing relatively well. It's Germany. You know, in terms of those who are in business, they might be doing small business, et cetera, but it's within a national plan. They don't deviate much of that. Even the foundations which we are working with here, Adenauer, they get funding from the government. It is one kind of constituency they are concerned with. Friedrich Ebert, yes, they get funds from the government and they are working with us in a specific area, but it is a very strong coordination amongst them in terms of what these national plans and what to achieve in a certain period of time. We don't have this with our governments most of times.
Yes.
So we need to create that space, trust, plan together, work differently, but we come back, we assess how well we are doing, what are the lessons we have to learn from one another, how then we improve, but a space of trust and knowing that we all have the interests of the nation, the interests of citizens at heart.
Very, very powerful views, very, very powerful views, really powerful views. Thank you so much. So, Your Excellency, you know I'm coming to you, right? I'm coming to you because you are now looking in from the outside, right? You've been there, you were the president of a country from a government standpoint. The points and the viewpoints that have been expressed in the last few minutes are very powerful. If we take on what Mrs. Michelle just said around trust between public sector and private sector and all stakeholders, civil society, etc., what is your take now looking in from the outside?
Well, even looking from outside or looking from inside, I have always been a great advocate, and I think this has been the message which has come across from OB and also from Grush as well, is we need to work on our institutions. We need to develop strong institutions. And I think one leader had said in the past, Africa needs strong institutions and not strong men and women. And one country has shown that they can do away with government for at least 9 months, Belgium, and the country run without any problem. So, okay, it's taking it a bit far, but what I'm trying to say is that when countries have invested, and I think this is the message which come out from OB, coming out from Madame as well here, that
From
Gracia, sorry, that to increase this notion of accountability, to look at the issue of national compact, issue of global compact. These are all institutions that are promoting certain values.
Right.
And the certain values is trust, as you have rightly said, but also values of institution building. And I have always said, coming from the academic world, we always look up to the Harvard, we look up to the Cambridge, we look up to the Oxford, we look up to Cape Town, we look up to Pretoria, because these institutions have invested and have appointed guardians of these institutions. So these people, the mandate is when they come into the institution and by the time they leave, they have to ensure that the institute has become stronger. And this transcends government. Cambridge has existed for over 600 years. It hasn't moved in iota in terms of quality because the guardian have ensured that the institution reputation is preserved. And this is something that we have to build in. As I said this morning, credible data will come from credible institutions, and credible institutions are made with credible people, and this has to be sustained throughout. Up until then, we will still be going to this narrative of discussing whether we should encourage accountability, whether we should be, we have to keep on building our institutions.
Can I come in
Yes,
here?
please, yes.
I'm sorry to...
No,
to-
please.
You know, one of the issues which worries me in this African narrative is how do we, in this building of institutions, how do we generate knowledge which transforms our own institutions? In this case, I'm talking of the high level of learning and research to be credible enough to generate knowledge which, yes, it can be universal, but it responds directly to the needs of our own people
Yes.
at the stage
Yes,
in
yes,
which
yes,
we are.
yes.
So we need, why do we have always to go to Harvard? Why do you always to go to Cambridge? To go, we can, I mean, we have had already in the past universities
Yes.
of really of a high quality. And it's high time African countries and African leaders in this case really to invest in those institutions, to generate knowledge and to give rise to our scientists who have to shine and to show that they connect knowledge but with the realities, and the realities they also feed into what they have. For instance, I would ask you, how many countries do have a very clear research agenda in which you can say universities are researching because, yes, they need to develop knowledge, generally speaking, but really they are responding to specific issues which society needs them to do. Many times we have hundreds and thousands of research papers which are putting dust. They are not being, I mean, useful to solve our problem. Yet, then you'll go to SOAS. I'm Chancellor of SOAS anyway. But you'll go to other institutions in the north to look for knowledge which has been developed in the perspective of what those institutions, what they pay for. They choose what they want to research on the continent. But we need to be the ones to be very intentional. Like, for instance, one of the examples, positive examples you mentioned, the issue of HIV. We did have some universities who really confronted HIV in a very focused way. But I think why, for instance, we do not know enough of how to produce food on this continent.
Just quickly on that.
Food.
Yes.
I mean, food for us. And food, and it's not only, I mean, to have mealies and cassava, etc., but a diversified food. And so that we have not only in quantity, but in quality. So that we confront the issues, for instance, of stunting. Who is studying the problem of how to overcome the tragic situation of having 43% of kids in this continent are stunted? But where do you find a serious, I mean, line of research and feeding into policy, feeding into implementation for us to overcome stunting? So again, this issue of, we need to be developing really intentionally our institutions to be responding to the challenges even more, to be forthright and looking forward to what we are in 21st century. It's not only to deal with the issue of hunger, but how do we catch up in science and technology with the rest of the world? That is not very clear. If you look to, at our universities, most of them, they are not, I mean, ahead of times to help to transform society. And I think this is one of the issues we have to discuss, because we have brilliant people sitting around this table. And when we say we have to work with our government, this is part of what we have to bring to the table.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of philanthropists here who are doing work on higher education, who are investing in education. And this is part of also our role as philanthropists.
Exactly.
And all the various stakeholders. Very, very powerful point indeed. I told you were going to crown the day with really powerful discussion.
Just 2 points
Yes,
to
please,
quickly wrap
please
what
do.
Russia said.
Please
In
do.
fact, you're absolutely correct. If we look at the HIV problem that was present, of course, in the 1990s, 80s, 90s in Africa, they did a study precisely in rural areas where people were feeding on sorghum, they were feeding on traditional foods. And they did the same study in town where people were feeding on fast food. And they found that those people who were precisely living in the villages, right, in the rural areas, they did not develop full-blown AIDS because of the quality of the food they were eating. That's one thing. The second thing, which is also coming out big time now, is when we come to drug testing. When we do clinical trial, it is found that increasingly we need to diversify because the genes, the African genes, respond differently to the treatment. And not just in terms of genetics, we're also looking in terms of gender. So men and women don't even react the same way. Now, increasingly, in fact, there was an article recently in the New York Times to show that they need to increase more Afro-Americans in the United States into the clinical trial because the dosage differ, because the genes react differently. So these are issues which bring us home again to the fact that this is why I completely concur with what Gosh has said. Invest in problems, but also not forgetting that we also need blue sky research, which is something that we don't do enough because we are very focused on short-term implementation of our research agenda, that we tend to forget that knowledge generation is 50, 60 years down the line. If Einstein didn't do his work in the 1950s, we wouldn't be having the mobile phone today. So these are things that we have to bear in mind, that knowledge generation also comes as part of the investment process of our institutions, which unfortunately is still lacking.
And business, actually, are good on this.
Yes.
Everyone who is a good CEO has a long plan of how to develop his business.
Yes.
They look at this, they don't plan for 5 years. They have a plan of 2025, and then they know how to do it. But that kind of vision from government side, it's not. The governments are really worried with the 5, 10 years in which he'll be in power.
Elections.
And that's the discussion I'm trying to bring here, that we are looking at a nation. We are not looking at the administration of a country in a specific time. And the experience of investing, and when we use the word investing, we mean investment. It means you are not going to have the result in 5 years' time, possibly. You look at a long-term perspective. And this is a contribution which private sector can bring, civil society organization can bring in the discussion with governments. We need to invest, and not only to have the quick fix, which is going to get you re-elected.
Wonderful.
Well,
Interesting.
you know,
Thank you.
I have done a lot of listening to my co-panelists, and and in the process of listening to them, you know, it sort of helped me to gather some thoughts
For sure.
On our topic again, which really says the changing face of leadership
Yes.
on our continent. And I do think that it is important for us to question our leadership recruitment process. On
That's
this
like a whole conversation. Right? Absolutely.
Give the government what they deserve.
Yeah.
Our leadership, you know, one thing that we know is that we're now at a place where at least 2/3 of the countries in Africa are now democracies, basic definition of democracy. And that's progress compared to what happened in the last decade of the 80s and the 90s. So there's progress. But that democracy is at such level of nascency that we need to do something quickly to mature it. And to mature that democracy means that we need to begin to pay attention to who enters our politics. What kind of quality of people are we playing the game of governance with? As in governance were a football match, are we recruiting the kind of people who would be, you know, in the top league? Would they be Man U, or would they be Arsenal, or would they be, which is the bottom league? You know, we have to start thinking. We have to start thinking of governance and the recruitment of the operators of our democracy. Because if you looked at the issue of leadership and the effect that it can have in the quality of governance outcome, whether it is in terms of building institutions or it's in terms of sound policies, whether they be economic, social, whatever policies, or it's in terms of prioritization of investment into the key sectors that matter for lifting the poor out of poverty, you would see that that role of leadership is indispensable. Because it is indispensable, every time you take leadership and give it to a lemon, you're going to get a lemon result. And that's what the key problem is for us with public sector. We must fix the leadership crisis on our continent. There is a serious leadership deficit on our continent. Let's not, fool ourselves about this. So what must begin to happen is that civil society would need to get the attention of some of the philanthropists to sort of say, how do you begin to look at leadership as a deliberate process where you're actually developing leaders, not just training people to be technical. For technical problems, we can buy technical solutions. But for leadership, we can buy. And that's why we're caught in a trap on our continent. And we've got to disrupt this. Now, the second part of my talk is that people keep saying institutions, as if there was some fiat by which you get institutions. I dare to say to you that governments put in place systems and processes and agencies, but they don't become institutions.
No.
They only become institutions when citizens awake and understand that lethargic citizens don't build institutions. You can wait forever. Institutions will not emerge out of the laws, out of the agencies. They will only become institutions when the pressure of demand for the performance of the basis for which they were established is placed on them by citizens. And that is why I now talk about the active office of the citizen. There's time when citizens of the continent looked away, waiting for some messiah to fix the problem. It's over. You've got to rescue yourselves.
Fantastic. Robert, yes. Before you get sandwiched.
Before I get sandwiched by all the great women.
He's a minority today.
I think
Minority today. In the minority today.
No, never a minority. Never a minority.
But that's also healthy because
Yes.
many of us, we have been in minority for
For a
too
long
long.
time.
So it's a healthy
I know,
place to have
I know,
that
I know.
chance.
No, but
Please,
talking about the changing face of leadership, I think it's about the changing face of leadership in the private sector, the changing face of leadership in the public sector, in civil society, etc.
Yes.
Now, if you come to the private sector, is it just about making profits at all costs? Do we care about issues around sustainability? Do we care about issues around the underserved markets? It was Thabo Mbeki who was talking about markets and demand and supply, all right? And if the private sector stops at that intersection, what happens to the people who are underserved? There's social pressure building up. I think the changing face of leadership also must be brought to
all
bear
stakeholders.
in the private sector.
Yes.
And for
Yes.
people to understand that we are all individually and jointly accountable. Now, we work on the assumption that every segment understands what they're supposed to do. It's not true. There is no government that fully understands its responsibilities. Mrs. Ezekwesili went on a one-man march, one-woman march.
I thought you were going to come here.
And did she have an impact? Absolutely.
did, yeah.
So, what am I saying? All of us have to think of how to create various oases of sanity. The institution I work for, which is Access, is determined to ensure that in its own way, it creates its own oasis of sanity. Now, the time that you keep talking about, oh, let's wait for the appropriate leadership, what is this? No, we have to get into the doing, all right? I'm tired of thinking and looking back and saying, let us wait. Things are going to get better. No, we have to actually get into the action
Who's
mode.
going to make it
And
better?
Let's,
Yeah.
let's make it better for ourselves. Now, if the previous generation failed us, we have no reason to fail the generation that is coming behind us, you know? And it's the truth. I mean, I sit between some of the most powerful women in the continent and who are saying the greatest things possible. Now, what do we really need to do to change all of this narrative? It means each and every person here has to join that whole exercise and start to show and portray Africa in a totally different light. I don't see myself just as a Nigerian. I see myself as an African as a starting point.
I want to stand
and then
up to that.
I just happen to come to
Amazing.
from Nigeria. We all are not, nobody here could have determined where he was born. Nobody. All right? We just come from this continent. Now, what do we do about making sure that the whole continent is seen as one market? How do our leaders, all right, and I'm talking about both private and public sector, ensure that they are interconnected? It is only then that we can create a strong, truly strong Africa, all right, that is standing, side by side with other global markets. Now, but the good news, though, is that things are changing for the better. And we have to comply. Now, some of those stereotypes around bribery, corruption, as if it were just from Africa, those words are English words after all, if you get the point I'm trying to make. I mean, they've existed everywhere in the world, but the world is craving for a new type of life,
Yes.
new values, etc.,
Yes.
etc. And I think what is important is for us together, jointly, together with our leadership, to say we are not going to be left behind. All right? Each time, all right, we don't rise up to the occasion, what happens is that Africa gets left behind. And
Yes.
what does it mean? Great private sector leaders, whether it's the Dangotes of the world or people, doing different things, would never emanate. So we have to do great things, and we have to get into action, the real actionable mode, whether in civil society or in private sector, in public sector, to solve it. A case in point, like you mentioned, Rwanda has done something great. Absolutely, whether you like to believe it or not. I mean, I don't care what people think about the leadership there. It is a great,
Yeah, it's a great
something
example.
has
Great
happened.
example.
All right. We are also beginning to see certain things in other countries, all right, in West Africa, perhaps not at the same scale, and until civil society leaders also rise up and tell government, this is our expectation. Citizens stand up at elections and say, this is what we want to do, if you get the point I'm trying to make. Then only, all right, we will be able to have and get the momentum that we desire.
Wonderful, wonderful. Fantastic, fantastic. I see. So we need to go back to the drawing table in the definition of what a CEO's role is.
Yes.
It's not just the typical traditional private sector CEO role. Maybe we need to write a job description all over again. For
Absolutely.
the role of a CEO.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. We all have a role to play, is what we're hearing. Now, the big question. Here comes the big question. The corruption question. Right? The corruption question.
I would like to speak
You'd like
to
to
that,
start that.
because Obi already blamed the private sector.
Please start. I was going to
didn't
start with that, but
blame.
please.
No, she
But please.
said that just as bad.
Yes, yes. So please start, help us to understand, how do we tackle this challenge
I think
and this image?
I think first of all, it takes two to tango.
Exactly.
You couldn't have called somebody from the public sector corrupt without his counterpart in the private sector. So everybody is complicit. Now, civil society is indeed playing a strong role, all right, because they're an independent party in putting pressure and ensuring that that ends. Now, several other institutions, like the Mo Ibrahim Governance Index, all right, which is rating countries, all right, along lines of good governance, corruption, ease of doing business, etc., and creating a transparent index, all right, for people to see and hold their governments responsible, is also a strong thing, all right? But I think as citizens, it's also important that we all rise to it, all right? And when we have those issues, we have to tackle it, head on, all right? And once that happens, more and more and more, I think you're going to see that whole issue drop off. But what is responsible for corruption, really? I mean, you also have to double-click and ask yourself, what is the problem? And across the continent, all right, it's because of the failure of institutions. And I don't want to go back into the definition, which Mrs. Obi executively spoke to, but it's the failure of institutions. If civil servants cannot pay their children's school fees, what do you think would happen? If they cannot pay the hospital bills of their children, would they sit down and see their children die?
Yeah.
All right? So we have to ask ourselves, have those basic things required to ensure that there's adequate the adequacy in terms of lifestyle and standard of living
Yeah.
for these people is appropriate.
Healthcare.
If you don't provide it, it is just a natural human tendency for it to happen. So, governments have to think of how do you lift the citizenry out of poverty. And it's not just government, all right? The private sector has to ask itself as well, what are we doing in that respect?
All stakeholders.
Yes, what are we doing in that respect? Now, you make money. What are you doing with respect to the underserved? All right, I come from a country where 60% or 65% of our population is under 35, all right? And there's a large number of children who are unemployed. What will happen to the future of those children, if you get the point I'm trying to make? So until we all start understanding, all right, and providing for that generation, all right, it will be difficult to solve that problem. But that solution can only start from today.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think, again, all these opinions and views, I think we all have a part to play as individuals in this room. We all have a part to play. But I know that the audience is itching to ask questions. This has been an amazing panel, but let me go to the audience and take some questions.
They have food in their mouth.
They have food in their mouth.
Now they have started eating,
So there's no questions.
it is going to be difficult to ask questions with them.
The microphone can go there. There's a question there. And because of the light, I can't see far, so if there's a hand up somewhere. Okay. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
My name is Nana Spielgaber. I work with the African Development Bank. And this question goes to anyone on the panel who cares to answer. We have seen recently that, as the CEO of Access Bank has said, the African continent is very young. And as a result, we've seen a lot of the new face of leadership be young people. So we've seen this in Ethiopia. I lived in Tunisia for 5 years, lived through the Arab Spring that was raised by young people. We're seeing it in Gambia and so many other countries. So if you had an opportunity to tell the youth, particularly those that are interested in politics or entering politics, any advice, what would be the one thing that you would advise them in order to realize some of the points that you've raised during the conversation?
The next generation, really. Very good question.
I would say, take tomorrow. Your future is truly in your hands. I think even though it is largely government's responsibility to provide the appropriate and enabling environment for people to thrive, I think young people and the use of social media these days, which has, by the way, its own deficiencies, all right, can put pressure on everybody, all right, to ensure that the youth are adequately supported. Because actually, they truly represent the future of our continent, if you get the point I'm trying to make. Now, most of the conversation that has happened today has had to do with the creation of institutions, the determination of our future, accountability, etc., etc. If you have a young, teeming population, they can determine the future of that country. They can determine what happens at elections, if you get the point I'm trying to make. And that is why you're seeing the nature of people who are coming out now as the new leaders. They are young, vibrant, etc. I mean, and it's not just in Africa, you know, across the world, it's beginning to happen. So I think they should just take a cue from it. Let them be much more interested, all right, in the politics. Let them be more interested in all the things around civil advocacy, etc. And their voices will be heard. Nobody can stop them anymore. In the past, you needed to reach out to newspapers. These days, just through that telephone, you know, the whole world will be screaming. Now, it has its issues, but quite frankly, on the balance, all right, you do have a voice, a stronger voice now.
Use your voice. Use your voice, really.
So, my biggest or my huge apologies to anyone from Zimbabwe in the room. So you have to forgive me already before I say what I'm about to say. When this conversation about the young politician and the old politician, when it comes up, I normally say to people to be careful of the dangers of a single story, like my compatriot Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said. I say to them to be mindful of it because we also have young Mugabes. That's the truth. You know, so it's a spirit of the wrong kind of the values of leadership. We knew, we were growing up, we knew Bob Mugabe, President Bob Mugabe. He was a hero for all of us as one who championed the fight for his country. But see what went wrong. Now, when it went wrong, there were young people around him. They would have imbibed some of that spirit of that kind of leadership. If we replaced old people with that spirit of leadership, we haven't made any difference, have we? No, really. So we need to be very mindful that it is not the matter of the age, it is the age of the idea that should matter to us. It is not the age of the individual. It's the age of the idea that backs up the leadership nuances, leadership values, leadership style, leadership vision, and we are missing that when we do the conversation as purely a conversation of young and old. And then the second thing is that for a young person to begin to think of leadership on the continent now, they would need to think of it from a differentiation perspective, right? They need to sort of say that the leadership of their parents didn't deliver much for the continent. But this is the best opportunity that the continent has to claim the 21st century. So we cannot have incremental leaders. We must have disruptive leaders from amongst the young people. So these are going to be the kinds of leaders that are basically saying disruptive technology can disrupt every kind of stagnation that we found ourselves in and just jump us up to a totally different dimension of development outcomes. So we need the leaders of the Internet of Things, the leaders of the age of the artificial intelligence, the robotics, the blockchain technologies. We want to see leaders who are conversant with everything that has to do with machine learning. We want leaders that are people of simulation science, data, big data. We want leaders that just completely, simply say, Africa can claim the 21st century.
Yeah, great. If I may add something, is one word, it's service. Service. Leadership. Service. Yeah, leadership to serve. And not leadership to sell.
Servant leadership, fantastic.
Servant, yeah.
Servant
English
leadership.
is not my
Wonderful.
language. So, yes. So, yeah, it's one of the issues, and Obi put it right. It's not an issue of age or not age. Although we must say, if our nations have such youthful, populations, young people want to see themselves in the leadership as well. So there needs to be a balance in terms of having some young people who take up high positions in politics, high positions as we have in business, etc., so that young people will identify themselves with the kind of thinking and the energy which comes from being young. When you have our parliament, I'm sorry to say, most of our parliaments, members of parliament, they're over 50, 60, 70. Sometimes they sleep in meeting. No, we have seen this because they are tired. So that is true. And so we need also to look at this and say, you have youthful population, you need to also to encourage and it creates, the space for young people to take up high positions in all levels. It's in government, it's judiciary, it's in business, in universities, etc., etc. So that's my point. But what I wanted to add to what has been said is that leadership, it's about service to the people. It's leadership, it's not only for you to be brilliant on your own. And leadership, it's not also to resolve problems of your group, and then, it's your ethnic group. leadership is to take into account really the profound aspirations of your people in totality, not only some people, and to say, how do you then talking about the transform? Exactly. So we lack also many examples of people who are committed to serve
Yes.
the people.
I agree with
And so when you ask my daughter, they said, what you do
No.
advise, part of advice is exactly, leadership is about service. It's not about self-service.
Absolutely.
So we decided that we would have everyone who becomes a leader on our continent, if we said that they must have character, they must have competence, and they must have capacity, we have captured the whole lot
All of
of
it.
what makes
All of
for a really sound and quality leader. I hope you will keep joining me in saying that we no longer want locusts as leaders. A locust is someone who is in leadership to serve themselves. They are transactional leaders. We no longer want dullards in leadership.
Yeah.
They haven't given any time to getting some expertise or knowledge around anything. We also don't want leaders that are lazy. There are really slothful leaders. And when a leader is slothful, the country will be slothful. That's the truth. So we need character, we need competence, and we need capacity to define our leadership.
And here I would also
I
like to
didn't
add
hear
one
about disruptive
element.
leaders. You forgot to add.
Already, that's
Okay.
captured on that
We didn't
category.
give you a chance. We didn't give you a chance, and you are
Oh,
the
I'm
example.
going to bring down this in a much more mundane. This notion of service, I fully agree. We also have to instill hope. I think this is something that was missing when there was the Arab Revolution. There was this feeling that there was no longer any hope.
Yeah.
But I think here, again, bring it down to much more down to earth, is that government has a role to play in providing the
inspiring,
enabling
yeah.
environment for this to happen, to nurture that notion of service, and also to create that notion that hope is not lost. And this is where government has a role to play. Unfortunately, we have to come back again to government because they have a key role to play to see to it that these young people become entrepreneurs. They become social entrepreneurs, they become also entrepreneurs, they become job creators and not job seekers. And this is something that we have to instill in the youth because the statistics of the World Bank are horrible. 11 to 15 million youth reaching the job market in Africa every year, and there's no way in hell any government can create that many jobs. So the notion that we have to give to the youth is there is hope, but you have to learn to take your destiny in your hands.
Yeah.
Just
think
one
we have-
final point from me. I know that you're carrying that card. That time is up.
We have just one more question.
Yes.
Just one more question. Please. Take the microphone there. There's a question there.
Hi, my name is Kennedy. I'm with the High Life Foundation. Just want to ask, there's this story on leadership, and I think there are various definitions of leadership. And when listening to the panel, you can tell that each of the panelists is looking at leadership from a different angle. I just want to ask, at what point will Africa become very deliberate in actually building that leader we're talking about? I'm talking of when will our governments and the philanthropists and civil society actually design leaders deliberately? To say in Zimbabwe, for example, we should have by 2020 100 leaders who will be able to go into these different sectors so that we actually see a deliberate growth of leaders that will go and transform our nations. And I would like to believe that that will take us into the transformation of the continent. Thank you.
That's a really good question.
It's a good question. Maybe I should just share my views. It happened in the 60s, for instance, in my country. And basically, the politicians at the particular point in time, most of them, Northerners, determined who was going to go into politics, who was going to go into academia, etc., etc., etc. But all that was abused over time. And I think it comes down to some of the points which Dr. Ezekwesili has raised and Her Excellency Mrs. Marshall has spoken about. It has to be a deliberate effort. Otherwise, the foundation will be lacking. Let me just put it very sharply and succinctly to you. until we can lift up people from poverty, the fundamentals of democracy will be threatened, because if I put a meal on your table for you to vote for me, you will vote for me. Yeah, so you'll not be thinking of just the best. You'll not be thinking of whether I'm a slut. You'll not be thinking of anything. You would vote for me. In Nigeria, they say it's the democracy, infrastructure of the stomach, if you get the point I'm trying to make. So it takes away all the reason from everybody. So what we need to do is to, again, put pressure on existing governments and bring them to their senses as to what their primary responsibility is, which is a big calling, as Our Excellency mentioned. The requirement that you are supposed to serve people, all right, and not to self-serve. And once you do that, all right, it means you're lifting up literacy levels, it means that you're helping people come out of poverty, then only can they begin to think, let us get the right leader. Let's get that disruptive leader, etc.
And when corporate people pay the tax, then
As
less
well, as
inequality.
Can I be practical and say to you that are gathered here that you could actually you could actually decide that you're going to embark on a project on building the kind of academies that deliberately, intentionally, strategically produce a leadership pipeline. I currently, one of the things that I'm working on under the program that I run basically advises presidents and their cabinets on how to really just articulate sound economic policies and human development policies, as well as execute them. In addition to that, we're working on establishing an Africa Academy to train policy people who go into government and can do really good work. So I think that this organization, this forum, you can decide on a project of that kind. Africa is vast. The pipeline that we need is huge. You can work on that and achieve that.
Yeah, I think we need, what you're saying is we need to take the toll of the likes of Africa Leadership Academy, Africa Leadership University, the Fred Swaneker story. We need a lot of that as well. So that being said, what an amazing discussion. But I have one final in closing from each of you. If you can just share in a sentence, share with me, what would you like your legacy to look like? Or what would your legacy, what are you looking to leave behind? And then in a tweet from each of you, in a tweet as we go along, from Herbert, what is a tweet that you would tweet to the private sector leadership? You've made some very powerful points. Mrs. Michelle, a tweet of advice to African philanthropists. Your Excellency, a tweet to governments and the public sector. Obi, a tweet to policy makers. So 2 sentences. One is your legacy, and one is the advice, the tweet that we're going to send out to the stakeholders.
Start from there.
I definitely have not been worried about legacy, about my legacy. I'm very honest about it. I've been simply doing things which I believe are important to do and I feel passionate to do. And what is going to be the legacy? It's the business of those who are going to judge how positive or not positive it is. So I'm not really able to answer that question, yeah. But the Twitter is what? On what?
To philanthropists, to the people in this room, yes.
Philanthropists.
Yes, African philanthropists. What advice if we have to send a tweet to African philanthropists? Most of which who are gathered here today.
Be deliberate in transforming communities in which you work. Deliberate, transforming. It's not only providing services, to transform those communities. Yeah.
Thank you. Your Excellency?
For the youth, I would say that your success will be my legacy. And the one in terms of, because we have been talking a lot about corruption and of course the private public sector, every corrupt action makes the country weaker.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. Very powerful. Thank you, thank you. Herbert?
I do have a legacy I'd like.
Yes.
I don't have a legacy, unlike Her Excellency. She doesn't need to have a legacy because it speaks for herself already. I want to be seen and known as one who has, with a team, created a strong, formidable platform that has helped several millions of Africans come out of poverty. That's what I want to be known for.
Great.
And your tweet?
And my tweet?
Yes.
I think
Private
our young
sector.
population in Africa is our strength. The private sector must use its strong convening power to ensure intergenerational collaboration, because only then can we unleash the true power of that young population that we have.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well done.
I would like to be remembered as the woman who refused to negotiate her values.
Who refused to?
Negotiate her values.
Negotiate our values.
And my tweet would be a person of assignment, not a person of jobs.
Wow. 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 The tweets will go out. Wow. What a powerful discussion. I would like, really, really, really insightful, really, really powerful. I couldn't have asked for more out of the four of you. And I know because of time, we weren't able to carry on. I know there was a lot that you were all itching to give us, but thank you so much. But I think with all of us, we came here to talk about, we were excited about the changing face of leadership and the transitions, but through that discussion, we've also learned that there's more work to be done amongst all of us, whether it's the public sector, whether it's the private sector, or whether it's philanthropists. All of us, there's work for us to do, and we've learned a lot from this discussion. So on behalf of APF, thank you so very much. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen,
behave
no
like Donald
wonder
Trump,
they
who
were
clapped for
called
himself.
the fireside chat. Plenty of heat coming from this panel. Another rousing round of applause for them. Well, thank you so much for an entertaining and exciting day one. We will gather tomorrow bright and early as we gather at 7:30 a.m. for breakfast and networking. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our closing act, the Mzansi Youth Choir. We can clap them off the stage. Well, the fireside chat really captured the imagination tonight, but it's the turn of the exuberance of youth to cap off the evening. Mzansi Youth Choir.
Sometimes alone in the evening, I look outside my window at the shadow in the night. I hear the sound of distant crying, darkness multiplies, and weary hearts tonight. All I feel is my heartbeat beating like a drum, beating with confusion. As the pain and the illusions will disappear again, and we will never run, 'cause in my African dream, I wish I in Africa. All I want is for a heartbeat to beat just as one, to silence that confusion. As the pain and illusions will disappear again, and we will never run, 'cause in my African dream, I wish I were Africa. Natingonya sithi ungonyama engabo sithi ungonyama engabo sisanibo nansi yabaleka nansi ngonyama bakithi baba sithi ungonyama ngonyama 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 hikena mabali Shaibapo, 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 Ngonyama, Shaibapo, 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 Ngonyama. From the day we arrived on those planets, blinking stepped into the sun. There's more to see than can never be seen, more to do than can never be done. There's far too much to take in here, more to find that can never be found. But the sun rolling high through the sapphire sky keeps great and small on the endless round. It's a circle of life. Until we find a place on this path unwinding in the circle of
Itali likhiphi ingomo sithi sahlabelela namhlanje sithi siyabonga namhlanje kukho konke okwenzakala sithi lilizela mlilizela kithi kukho konke okwenzeka sithi giyani mabutho ase-Afrika kithi konke kwenzeka sithi namhlanje sayibhala inkonzo sithi namhlanje imphongo izophuma sithi konke kuyathokoza namhlanje sithi siyabonga
Until we find a place on this path unwinding in the circle of life, circle of
Ngeke
Get umuntu maya kuthenga thambi ungavumi. Get umuntu maya kuthenga thambi ungavumi. Ngeke ngivume mina. Mina ngeke ngivume. Uyobulala umuntu ungavumi. Ngeke ngivume mina. Mina ngeke ngivume. Uyobulala umuntu ungavumi. Sabe madoda. Awungeke ngivume mina. Awungeke ngivume mina. Yasala wena. Nawe ungavumi. Awungeke ngivume mina. Nawe ungavumi. Awungeke ngivume mina. Nawe ungavumi. Awungeke ngivume mina. Nawe ungavumi. Hey khabo khabo. Awungeke ngivume mina. Hey khabo khabo. Nawe ungavumi. Ngeke ngivume. Ngeke ngivume mina. Nawe ungavumi. Ngeke ngivume. Ngeke ngivume mina. Ngeke ngivume mina. Nawe ungavumi. Umuntu maya kuthenga thambi ungavumi. Ngithi umuntu maya kuthenga thambi yokulala ungavumi. Hayi. Kumnandi bakithi bo. Kumnandi kwela kithi emzansi. Emaweni we baba, emaweni we baba, emaweni we baba, silale mawe, emaweni we baba, emaweni we baba. Sing. And we are home. We are homeless, homeless, homeless. Oh, Kizzy Oyami, Kizzy Oyami, Kizzy Oyami. How to Zuloya, my heart, Kizzy Oyami. How to Lulu, to Lulu. How strong winds, destroy our home. I am Bulala Makasa, Bulala Ma. We are homeless, homeless, homeless. We are homeless, homeless, homeless. Somebody say, somebody say, hello, hello, hello. Somebody say, somebody cry, why? Somebody say, somebody say, hello, hello, hello. Somebody say, somebody cry, why? Somebody say, mango, yele, mango, yes I know, yele, mango, mango, yele, baba, mango, auze baba, mango. Somebody say, somebody say, hello, hello, hello. Somebody say, somebody cry, why?
I think we deserve one more, man. I think we deserve one more. I warned you about the exuberance of youth. Well, that was Mzansi Youth Choir giving us a great performance, and what a way to cap off the day for today. And tomorrow, as I promised you, that we will convene at 7:30 for breakfast and our networking event. I don't know. It sounds like they're going to give us one more. Is that right? Yes, maybe? Are they going to give us one more? They're still young. They're fresh. It's not even 10 o'clock yet. I think they're going to give us one more. I hope your batteries are full. Well, the negotiator has gone to speak to the youth choir, and they've promised to give us one more jam before we can all leave. Well, there we go.
Becoming sanganga
Imkonto, imkonto, kasha, kasha. Imkonto, imkonto, kasha,
Makwaze,
imkonto,
kasha. Makwaze, imkonto, kasha. Sebati uyesamba, imkonto, kasha. Sebati uyesamba, imkonto, kasha. Makwaze,
Ladies and gentlemen, Mzansi Youth Choir. Well, that officially draws a close to today's proceedings. We will see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, 7:30.